engage in civic topics with the same arsenal of tools, with the same psychology, creativity, et cetera, that fuel consumer engagement. You just change the topic to civic engagement. Let's say, how do you get people to think about water very differently? This is something that a lot of branding companies are very well equipped to do. And ironically, there's a crisis in the brand world, a parallel crisis, which can very simply be summed up, and all the millennials in the room will probably chuckle at this. Your cohort in particular, and the people that are coming along after that, you don't really think of buying brands. You think of joining brands. So brand for you folks is almost like a movement. It's not a signifier of a thing. So in that sort of a sense, I think a lot about what brands, the role of brands in this world, what kinds of movements that companies and brands can create that are not just self-serving, that have a different, more wider social purpose as well, but use some of the very same techniques of persuasion, of engagement, and all of that. So I'm looking forward to an era where brands have this sort of sensibility of doing civic stuff with the same sort of rigor and also attractiveness that a lot of the consumer products enjoy today.
So I think I've probably asked enough questions now. We should probably open it up to some questions from the audience.
I get to ask you some questions?
I've passed my general's exam.
Let me, Colonel, will use a term you're accustomed to, suggest a mission. And start, though, with Ms. Touton on one, and it's been touched on earlier, and that's aquifer storage and recovery. And it impacts every one of you up there could have a role in it, certainly the federal government. And there's a precedent in it that whether it's the Tennessee Valley Authority or the lake system on the Missouri River, where the federal government has taken a leadership role and helped put in place massive infrastructure. And the thing about aquifer storage and recovery that's being done in a few places in the U.S. already, in other places around the world, but the determining factor is the geology, the right spot, the proximity to the coastline, interaction with the oceans. And it's one of those things where what's being called out for is a real mission of let's map where it works. Where does it work? Certainly on federal lands, you could envision banking water in the future. I'd like for each of you to talk about that, that's one clear thing with the technologies now for mapping groundwater and subsurface conditions. Might we not see that as a mission we could undertake now in a collaborative effort and involving the private sector?
So I guess there's a couple of issues on groundwater that have been touched on. There's the gray satellites that Scott showed in his presentation that shows the difference in gravity so that you can measure groundwater changes over time. But with the USGS, what they've are trying to do is do a survey of all the major aquifers in the United States. So we undertake one every year. But again, it's at a larger basin scale than it is at specific aquifer sites. This certainly is a baseline that you can use for then looking at different areas. There are areas within the United States where it's already happening. For instance, within the Colorado River Basin, Arizona has banking agreements with Nevada to store Colorado River water and be able to pull that water out in times of drought. So there are certainly places that folks are doing it. There's limitations as well because of how groundwater is managed within the different states. But we are certainly engaged in looking at groundwater.
You hit on it just about right. The answer is yes, we should and we can. The science would allow us. Some of the hurdles, and in some cases we're looking into that in areas where it's necessary, in areas where it already kind of naturally occurs, the natural connection between surface water and groundwater. There's a big water rights issue out there, and I talked about this earlier about you talking about what are the biggest risks for water resources management moving forward, and some of this hits on one of them, and this is how we manage water and the water rights. Right now, most of the groundwater is subject to state jurisdiction or private landowner jurisdiction or whoever owns the right, depending on where you're at and where you're using Western water rights and stuff. A lot of the surface waters are managed or owned or in some way, shape, or form taken care of by the federal government. And so right now, when you get in an interagency discussion on this, they look at it as gains and losses from their pot of water, when really it's our water. You know, when really it's collectively, both of those are governmental agencies manage water or landowners. So that's probably not a healthy way to look at it moving forward. So that looks like a policy change. But those are some of the hurdles we're running into. The other thing, the aquifers, you know, when you're talking about land rights and water rights and who uses it and who gets the benefit of it, the aquifers have different boundaries. They cross landowner boundaries, they cross state boundaries, and they cross a lot of other boundaries. So that's another thing we just kind of have to work through. And then just depending on what's going on in the rivers and lakes versus how much the groundwater is being tapped for irrigation or for fracking or for whatever's taxing it, those interactions are happening naturally, and we're running into some issues with that where it's just happening naturally. How much of the surface water is now being sucked into the groundwater aquifers and then pumped out by an oil company for fracking purposes, and what are the legalities and who owns it, and so there's a discussion going on with that. And so I only say that to say is you're absolutely right. The answer is yes, and there's a lot of issues to work through to get there. Scientific issues, policy issues, and ownership issues.
I mean, you guys have covered a lot of the key issues. You know, we do still have challenges from the providing information. The satellite the satellites for the gravity mission are very good on a large scale, but a lot of the aquifers, this mismatch in scale between how we manage things and how we observe things. So there are still some issues there. Along the coasts, you know, it's not just the amount of groundwater, but it's also the quality of the groundwater. We're seeing a lot of saltwater intrusion that is both related to sea level rise, but also because of pumping. And so I think we need to fold into this not just the amount of water, but the quality of the water, whether it's salt intrusion or pollutants, particularly in shallow aquifers. A lot of the aquifers we would like to tap into that are naturally replenished have pollution contamination and are not usable for many things. And so this ties into, you know, all sorts of soil quality as well as groundwater. I don't know if you had any.
Colonel Henderson, could you give us an estimate of either in acre feet or in percentage of how much water is lost by evaporation from the reservoir system that the Corps manages?
I can talk about the Missouri system. You know, when you create a lake out of a major river, that creates a big evaporation pool. I would say, I shouldn't make any estimates on that. It depends so much by region and aridity and the surface area and everything that goes into evaporation. But you know, conservatively, I'd say we probably lose 10 to 15% of the water just through evaporation and storage. Now and there's probably a whole bunch of people that know more about it than me here that could probably give a better number, but that would be my guess.
Does the Department of the Interior concur?
I can give you an example of a specific reservoir, I guess, and its evaporation. Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir, it's roughly 1 million acre feet a year. And when you look at Lake Mead, 1 foot in the reservoir is 100,000 acre feet, so it's about 10 feet of evaporation every year. That being said, it's also right outside Las Vegas, and it's very hot. So, yes,
Yeah.
we lose a lot of
I'd pull
evaporation.
the most germane knowledge I know from what happens in the Midwest in the Missouri Basin, and that's just a different climate belt than
Yeah.
what's out west. So, that's about the right rate.
Sorry, thanks. This is a kind of different question and maybe even silly, but on a scale from 1 to 10, how confident are you that we are going to be able to solve this problem without a lot of pain?
Oh, that's an easy one. So I'll give you the short answer. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's 1. I think we're going to iteratively get after this problem, some by forcing function. I mean, bad things are going to happen, and it's going to cause us to change the way we look at things. But there's going to be a lot of pain. I think we'll get there, but there's going to be a lot of pain. There's no way about it. And I don't mean to paint a negative view on it. It's just that there's a lot that has to happen that there's a lot of interested stakeholders in. And I'll let anybody else comment on that too, but that's just my purview.
I guess, I mean, there are multiple routes to solutions, and I think everybody's kind of alluded to, there is no single solution to the water and climate change problem. And so I think we need to continue to push forward. I'm not going to give you a number, but I'm actually pretty hopeful that I do think that there's movement forward on mitigating future climate change. And so we've mostly been talking about how to adapt. What are we going to do as the water resources change? But the other side of the problem is, well, there are approaches to limit how much future change there might be by limiting the size of the climate change impact.
And I'll jump in quickly. I had a much higher number in mind before you added that caveat at the end, without pain, which changes everything. I honestly believe, like most of my co-panelists are concurring with this thought, I think, there is going to be pain, but depending on how the pain's distributed, it could either be unbearable or not. So it's a question of how do we come together to distribute the pain. There is going to be pain. We're almost too late to have non-painful solutions on the table.
Question for everyone, but particularly for Camille and Colonel Henderson. I'm wondering if you encounter any resistance within the government. I know that there are some folks in government that don't really believe in climate change, or at least publicly, bring snowballs into the Senate and say there's, climate change doesn't happen because it's cold outside. So I'm just wondering, do you encounter any resistance? I know the government is a big entity, but towards your activities and your mission.
Well, it certainly helps from the top that President Obama has been very vocal about the effects of climate change. But when you go back into within the agencies, and you really have to tie it back to mission. I mean, Reclamation's mission is to deliver water and power. And so from that sense, it's a part of our mission to figure out how climate change impacts our water resources. And so it really is a top-up, but also a bottom-down approach. And there certainly is a lot of friction in the middle, but you really have to look at what perspective they're taking and approach it in that way.
I glossed over this in the briefing, not on purpose, but you'll notice because we get sued a lot. So I try to be very careful with my words in public. Okay, so the words are chosen very carefully. I'm normally I can speak pretty well, but when I'm doing stuff like this, I literally have to read a script sometimes to make sure that I don't have a nuanced way of presenting the information. And one of the nuances, when I said that we're taking an engineering approach to this, we don't talk about what causes climate change. Not because I don't maybe have a pretty good idea what causes climate change. It's politically charged right now in the government. So when you're working in government, wherever anybody falls on one side or the other, what's causing the climate change, right now I have to deal with the reality of climate change. And so we're saying, great, it's happening. We're going to deal with it the best we know how right now, and we're going to stay out of the discussion about what's causing it. The reason I pulled up this picture, this is a picture from the 2011 flood in a place just north of Omaha, Nebraska. It's the Fort Berthold nuclear power plant. And if that doesn't just scare the heck out of you, right? By an act of coincidence, it was the fueling cells, the fueling rod, it was being refueled at the time, so it was shut down. But with all the levees, and the reason it's by the river, which someone would cause, why would you put a power plant by the river? But you have to cool them off, right? You need water for cooling. So they put it right by the river so it would have ample water. And so just inside our geographic boundary, I've got about 4 of these. So we're forced to look at the risk of climate change when a 500-year flood comes through because maybe the hydrologic data that we were using to build what we would call a 100-year storm set of levees, we didn't take into account the 500-year, maybe some of the catastrophic circumstances. Because, if you look at this picture, there's some uncanny similarities between the picture the year before in 2010 that were coming out of the Daiichi area of Japan and the Fukushima power plant, where a lot of water rushed in and hit the reactor, and they had an uncontrolled shutdown and a lot of other bad things that happened. So inside the government, we take this approach of at least when the Corps of Engineers has to deal with these things, to manage the risk. And we're working very closely with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission right now on how to make these nuclear power plants more resilient to ensure, and we're not moving it because it's there, but we're going to make sure that that this wouldn't happen when the power plant's running live. So when we take these in small chunks and say, okay, this is an issue of national concern, this is a place where we need to build in some resiliency. We're going to have to factor in all the uncertainty and everything we can for an adaptable future. And not only is there structural solutions to this, there's non-structural solutions, there's other things that we can do to keep this picture from being able to happen again. But it's things like this that force us to come up with the right solutions. And then generally, as long as we all got a common goal in mind, like let's make sure this doesn't happen again, we can pull a lot of federal agencies together under conflicting authorities and different jurisdictions, and we all work together pretty well when the urgency is there. So that's what I'll say about that.
The group talked a little bit about adaptation, and it was mentioned that we are adapting slowly, painfully, but we're lagging. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what are examples of groups that are actually doing a good job? Who's leading the way? And in your opinion, who should be leading the way?
I don't know why people are looking at me. I honestly don't. I'll offer up a perspective. I don't know if these people are leading the way. I'm not sure what that means, like leading the way. But it's a place we can look to for not just inspiration, but also other sorts of hints at how we talk about this problem, I think. And I intend for this example to fully surprise you, and maybe I've hinted at this by mentioning the Bolivian constitution. The group that I'm referring to, it's a large group spread out, is indigenous people and indigenous wisdom. Because, I opened up with this view of science and some of the pitfalls that the scientific attitude has. We could learn a lot by entering into a dialogue with people who have other systems of thought, where questions like this that befuddle us, what causes climate change, and paralyze action, simply don't occur. Yeah? Their answer to that problem would be because we've manipulated nature without observing the laws of nature and living in accordance with them. It's a pretty simple explanation for it, for something that befuddles and paralyzes us. And I'm wondering if those kinds of explanations, because they're simple and not controversial, and nobody can really argue with that. In fact, Peter Gleich, who runs the Pacific Institute, has done a how do you call it, survey of hydrological eras, if you will. And he calls the era that caused all the problems we're wrestling with the era of manipulation. So just to give you an illustration, from 1950 to 2000, just in the short span of 50 years, we've built about 40,000 of the biggest dams in the world today, in a 50-year span. Yeah? Before that and after that, there are very different ways of how to approach hydrology, and we're representative of a very different view of that. And there are people 7 generations, 20 generations before us have thought about the same things. They weren't wrestling with the conditions and the problems that we have now, but they have something to contribute to this discussion. So that's one constituency that I wonder what they would say about the problems we have today if we manage to talk to them and include them in our conversations.
So that's something at Interior that we have been looking into called TEKs, or tribal ecological knowledge, and how you sort of integrate that in a world of the scientific knowledge, because some of those aren't, as you said, it's just something that's learned within generations and passed along. A good example is on the Colorado River. We were on a tour on part of the river, and there's this yellow paint coming out of one of the rocks. And one of the tribal members who was with us said that that was a sign to their elders of distress in the system. And, you know, it's like, how do you incorporate what they see and what they've learned into what is scientifically happening from a baseline? It's very difficult, but it certainly is a perspective that's interesting and important to have.
I would just, you know, the one thing that's missing from this panel, if you were to think about the food, water, energy nexus, is the food. You know, the people who are day-to-day, you know, if you're managing a farm, my brother actually lives up in Great Falls, so is in your district, they have a lot of experience of dealing with climatic fluctuations, of how to adapt their agriculture. It's amazing when I go up and visit my brother how attuned they are to information. Now, it's not the same way that I might be attuned to information, but they're in many ways on the front lines of adapting to a changing water system. And that's something that would be really great to bring into this conversation, is the people who are really affected on a day-to-day.
I'm gonna give you a federal government answer. They said who should be leading the way on adaptability. I think it's the federal government, and I say the federal government, at least in the United States. One, the United States is probably, as a world leader, probably has a role to play in that. But the federal government, not as an us versus them, and the federal government in the way that we're all part of the federal government. In some ways, the federal government's not changing fast enough, but since it's a democracy, I think everybody sitting here in this room has a role to play in that. If you make it important to the people that you elect to the government, or you make it an issue during an election, and then you start to see changes in the way the federal government operates, and the people who make the laws and the people who make the decisions on what gets funded and what doesn't get funded. So I say all of us have a role in the leadership role in that. And we have a great opportunity with a government that can do that. And as far as adaptability, whether it is the food, water, energy nexus is very important discussion with all this, because how we use energy and the water it takes to produce energy, whether it's the water to cool a coal-fired plant or a nuclear plant, or the water it takes to run a hydropower plant, we use a lot of energy. So to change those societal norms, or to change the policies of the laws, we use and abuse and waste a lot of water and a lot of food. You know, we could take a leadership role in the world on how to deal with some of that stuff, but some of that involves us maybe changing as a country and some of our societal norms to get there, and that gets back to some of the pain we talked about. But the federal government could take a lead on that with policy changes, and that would have to be, it's a democratic government, it should be driven by all of us. Not a thou shalt do this, you know, as a dictatorship. It should be the will of the people. And as soon as the will of the people changes to make it very important for the people that we elect into office, then I think we could see some real leadership and some real change.
And that goes back to what we keep talking about with science, but in this case too with politics. I mean, it's all about scalability, and a lot of it is politics is local, right? So if you're really impacted on a certain scale, you're going to talk to your congressman about this and make it an issue. And so it really does move in different levels within the federal government, but also just within industry, academia, within our communities, that you have to be scalable as part of a solution, whether it's looking at scalability of science, but also the scalability of a problem and how it impacts communities and in politics.
And I would also point to the design discipline, and I'm sure all of you are reading or thinking or actually doing design thinking or design doing in a sense. And I'm interested, I work with a lot of designers in my company, and I'm not talking about graphic design, you know, I'm talking about big D design kind of a thing. And I'm impressed by the discipline because it takes a lot of the things that we're wrestling with as constraints and goes from there. You know, they're fantastic about using constraints to actually fuel creativity. Again, just as an illustration, if you're in a desert, one of the things we almost assume is that you have to get water in from somewhere because deserts don't have water, they're dry climates. If you say to a designer, that's a constraint. We're not going to truck in water from anywhere else. Somehow you have to design a water system in the desert itself. Suddenly it forces them to think in very different directions. This is a very small scale. It's almost like an art project scale. But it was done in a very arid part of Ethiopia. And they were basically using the temperature differential between day and night, which is extreme in deserts and produces moisture. The problem is it burns off in the first 5 minutes of daylight. Yeah? But if there was a way to capture it during the day, and they built this beautiful wicker basket from locally made materials that's about the size of a Burning Man sculpture, and it collects moisture, almost becomes a water tap in the middle of a desert. So it's one example of how design can take a constraint and completely reimagine new solutions. So I feel very hopeful about the discipline of design in general.
Do you have time for one more question, maybe? Or? No? Okay,
No.
one more. One more question.
One more? Okay, this speaks to Manaj's point about looking at things differently. We've talked a lot about how to adapt to these issues with water and water cycles. I'm just wondering if any of you know of any projects or are working on any projects that actually use water hydrological cycles for the mitigation piece of climate change.
You know, there's a lot of work going on. I'm not going to come online and say human-induced climate change, but there's a lot of work going on with biosequestration right now, and carbon sequestration. It's very interesting. We're doing a lot of work and looking into that as a way to take some of the carbon emissions and potentially pump them into the ground in a place that would be inert. But we get to start talking about groundwater issues. So we're working through some of those issues, but ways to limit carbon and carbon emissions. We get a look at this through the Corps of Engineers through our regulatory program. Anytime somebody wants to do something that impacts waters of the U.S., generally we get a chop on it, and BOR probably has some permits that they get a chop on. But when those things come up, we do an environmental impact statement, and through NEPA, we get a chance to have a discussion about what those impacts are to the environment, and then have a discussion based on the technology available, if it's feasible, to mitigate the impacts caused to the environment. And we're taking a lot of look at the carbon emissions, along with the impacts to water, along with the impacts to wildlife species, along with impacts to everything else. And while if you're a private entity applying for one of those permits, it's extremely painful. But on the other hand, it's a role that the federal government's taken on to kind of mitigate the impacts of future damages to our environment and our ecosystems, and to global warming, if you want to put it in the carbon realm. So anyway, just a few thoughts on that, I guess.
And to add to that, the Department of Interior, and I think just the federal government in general, is moving towards what you're outlining as like more of a landscape level understanding. One of the good examples from Interior is most recently the Secretary announced that we would not be listing sage grouse in the West on the Endangered Species Act, which was a huge momentous occasion in the sense that we found a way to be able to preserve this species and also its habitat, but also encourage development of oil and gas, among other things that's happening in the West. But by really looking at it from a landscape level understanding, there was a lot of environmental documents that will go into it. We're already getting sued. But it was really a different way of looking at it. Instead of looking at each permit one by one, looking at how it impacts all of the habitat for the sage grouse in, I think, 9 different states. And we had the governors of those states, might be 7 or 9. Well, we had those governors, mostly Western governors who are Republican, who were supportive of this initiative because they understood what it meant for development, but also for protecting the species. And so looking at it from those environmental impact statements and those documents, looking at it from a broad perspective is helping with mitigation. We can't plug hydropower.
Oh, yeah, so go ahead. You can talk the hydropower piece because you got it too, so.
So, that's there are some challenges with hydropower, but it is a carbon-free power supply. The difference is our fuel is decreasing with droughts and other things, but we're looking at different research opportunities, and we're different turbines so that you can use it for low flow, really maximizing the efficiencies of these projects that have been built for half a century, and how we can make them more efficient and create more power.
I want to let you guys talk too, but you said the sage grouse, and it spurred a bunch of. There's some good stuff going on. There's a program in the Corps of Engineers called the Ecosystem Restoration Program. I think it's 1109. I can't remember what this section is necessarily, but we do a lot of them, and they're funded very well right now because of the political will of the people for the most part, and what Congress will give them. We have more funding than we can spend on these projects. And they're little bits, and we go back and take a look at impacts, negative impacts that we collectively have had on the environment over the years through the construction of dams or through the limitation of sediment or whatever it is. And we go back and take what we can and try to restore the natural structure, the natural ecosystem the best as it is. And I've had the opportunity over the years on the Mississippi Basin and in the Missouri Basin to work as an engineer, as a technical engineer on the restoration of some of those systems. And they're extremely rewarding projects. They don't cost a lot of money. We're doing several of them in the Colorado region right now. We have several on the books for this next year coming up. So that's just another great area where we're mitigating the impacts we've had. There's a huge program on the Missouri River called the Missouri River Recovery Program, if you've ever heard of it, where we spend millions of dollars every year restoring the impacts from the 6 main stem dams and the 21 tributary dams that we've constructed over the years. Restoring the native habitat for endangered species, the piping plover and the least tern, and the pallid sturgeon is a species on the Missouri River. So we're putting a lot of time and effort into recreating habitat for the endangered species. We're doing a lot of work on the sediment issues. There's sediment issues come in a lot of ways. One that builds up in the dams and causes problems with the operation of the dams, but it also sediment starves the areas of the river below the dams, so you don't get the natural sandbar habitat, the replenishment of the riparian areas and stuff like that. So we're looking at projects to restore all that. And they're well funded. It's just a matter of getting the projects out there and kind of getting the will of people behind the technical side of it. So that's more good news. I've been talking pretty negatively all night, so I thought I'd throw that out there for things that we're doing that are actually good. So,
and just to end up, so one of the technical challenges you mentioned the hydro is how do you get quote unquote clean power that's not releasing carbon that minimizes the environmental damage. I guess I'm hopeful, and I'm not an engineer, but what I've seen there are companies that are now promoting run-of-river turbines that don't involve a dam. There's some really exciting developments on energy production from waves and some new tidal technologies. All of these are small bits in the mitigation. They're not going to replace coal, but they can contribute, particularly on a local scale. So I do think the engineering looks really promising that we might actually have commercially viable projects with wave or in-river turbines within the next few years. So I think it's something to look out for if that's something you're interested in.
We've been putting them in canals too, in irrigation canals as well. They're very small, at 1.5 or 2, but to an irrigation district, that's a lot of power.
So I think we should cut the discussion there. I think it's been a great panel, and we should thank all of our panelists.
As a thank you from the MIT Water Club, we have some gifts. The gifts are sponsored by the MIT Co-op, and can I invite Professor John Leonhardt to present the gifts to the panelists?